Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Adrienne Martinez Hollingsworth. I'm new here at Samuel Merritt University, and I am your new Dean of Operations and Scholarship. So part of the scholarship piece is that we're going to be doing training for early career scientists and also for mid-career scientists, and this is the first meeting of the level 1 group, which is kind of the early career scientists and researchers who want to kind of understand how to grow their program of research from scratch, and people who are looking for specific methodological advice. So I am going to record all of these sessions. People will pop in and out, but that way we can have a record, and if people want to look back at earlier trainings, they're more than welcome to. So I am going to share my screen right now. And I'm going to be talking about building a program of research. And I think this is important as far as topics go, just because I think we tend to see our interests and our experiences as sometimes just one-offs and not reflective of a larger body of work. So again, I'm Adrienne. And I'm new here at Samuel Merritt University, but I do also maintain a position at UCLA and at Charles D. University. I have affiliations with those universities because they house some of my active research. So I just wanted to remind everyone of the philosophy of scholarship, and this is directly out of the SMU faculty handbook, because I think it's important to understand that at SMU, I'm learning it's different than it is at other universities. And I actually really appreciate the broad definition of scholarship that is applied here, because it really allows you to explore interests that in some places aren't traditionally termed research, but are really relevant and important work that needs to be done in this space. So the term scholarship embodies a spectrum of activities and academic pursuits that faculty engage in as part of their role as academicians. So this is actually baked into the job. There is some expectation, but it can include the scholarship of discovery or integration or teaching and learning, or application and service, which is an interesting one because there is also a service component. So we can talk a little bit about that. But just to kind of quickly go through these, the scholarship of discovery really focuses on scientific inquiry that generates new and unique knowledge. This is kind of your fundamental understanding of research in a lot of environments. And it can be basic science, it can be applied clinical research or translational studies. And there are some examples here that you can review, some that are fairly traditional and some that are often seen as kind of the pre-research aspect of a project, which is really getting the state of the science, having that understanding, including the systematic reviews and meta-analyses. There is the scholarship of integration, which focuses on the discovery of new relationships among disciplines. So it uses concepts and original work from yours and other disciplines to create new patterns. And it places knowledge in this kind of larger context and illuminates this knowledge in a more meaningful way. So this is kind of more theoretical, but it can include these integrative reviews beyond just kind of a metasynthesis. It can be a critical analysis of systems and specifically to support interprofessional work, which means it doesn't need to be nursing specific. It can really be more broad. Evaluating communication between multiple disciplines or developing practice guidelines. In terms of the scholarship of teaching and learning, this is about developing innovative teaching and evaluation methods. It spans a lot, right? So learning outcomes and aspects of delivery of healthcare where you're solving relevant problems to the profession or the community. So this is a little touches on implementation science as well. And examples can be evaluations of the use of technology on student learning outcomes, right? There's a variety of things listed here, but it really is about classroom focus, teaching focus, making sure that it is about continuing the experiences that our students have into other environments and then just really refining them at home. And then the scholarship of application and service. So this includes the investigation and evaluation of the impact and the value of service activities, which again, these are tied to their profession or our profession, but this can be the community work that you're doing to kind of build relationships. This kind of stuff is often funded by PCORI. But the idea is that it can include the identification of unmet needs for community groups or populations, and try to understand or develop plans that are specific to that group. And again, there's a lot of stuff here, but there's examples available. This whole section in the handbook is, I believe, pages 36 to 40, and it's much more comprehensive than what I've presented. But I do just want to reinforce this idea that there's a lot of ways to do scholarship and research. And unlike a lot of other environments, SMU seems to really value that. They understand that there's a lot of ways that people can contribute, and it seems really important. But there is a push for dissemination, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about how dissemination impacts your overall effect as a researcher and how you build a body of work. But again, it should be through an acceptable means of scholarly work, right? But it's interesting because the type of scholarly work being performed and the target audience, because sometimes the target audience is not these like lofty academic journals, but it can be conferences and work with community groups, or maybe influencing policy at the local or state level. So there's a lot of options here, and we have a lot to work with, which is really exciting. So now, in terms of building a body of work, I would like to talk a little bit about the vicious cycle. And, you know, this can be a very rewarding cycle, and that's nice, because if it works for you, it works for you. But if it doesn't work for you, it can be tremendously challenging. Give me 1 second. I just want to make sure. We have some individuals who may have signed in on the Teams app. I have that running simultaneously, so people can actually join the Zoom link if you'd like to be able to see these slides. But here's the vicious cycle. So you are practicing healthcare professional, and you notice something and you want to do a study. So maybe you do your study, and if you are doing this kind of correctly, you will actually publish the findings of that study, which is really great, because when you publish, which is the final step of the scientific method, by the way, you start becoming known as a topical expert, right? You yourself become known. They start associating your name with whatever it is that your topic of interest is. And so as you're doing studies and publishing findings, your name is really starting to come out in Google Scholar searches, and people are starting to see you at conferences. And because you're getting more visibility through the dissemination process, collaborators start to seek you out, which means other researchers from other universities and academic environments, when they think of an idea that has some aspect of your work, they're going to contact you and really want to leverage your advice. So when you start making these inroads with other researchers, what happens is that, you know, you're first author on your papers, but you're collaborating and creating publications where maybe you're second author or third author or last author, if this is really about your field of study. And so that is more publications that support that you have knowledge in this area. And when you go to submit a grant that, you know, perfectly applies to what you have a background in and what you've wanted to do, you were qualified before, but now you actually have evidence of this knowledge, because your dissemination and these different products, the manuscripts and posters and speaking engagements and all these other things, actually make you that expert. And you're much more likely to get a grant because now you've really built this body of work and people trust you. And getting financial awards that help buy out your time in order to do research, these are generally handed out to people who have a proven track record of, you know, designing and running an effective study, making sure that they're disseminating, collaborating, and really proving that you're a good deal. You're not risky. If we give you the budget to run a much larger study, you have either pilot data, or at least you've kind of proven that you're reliable and you can do a lot in this space. So I call it the vicious cycle because a lot of people stop right here. They do the study or the intervention, and then life happens. They either don't have the support that they need to kind of move forward, or they get busy, or honestly, it can feel really overwhelming. And so you have tons of data, maybe from your dissertation or your capstone project, maybe from your master's or undergrad, and you just kind of get stalled in this place. And it really knocks you out of the running of all of these other opportunities that would open themselves up to you. And I think it's important for us to know that. Oops. The other thing is that I see people sometimes stall at the do a study space. People come in with these fantastic ideas, usually implementation or practice-based ideas, but they're not really sure how to quantify it. They don't really know the methodology. They're kind of intimidated by some of the methodologies because there's a lot of investment in making research feel much more formal than it needs to be sometimes. And so people can kind of get stuck in these two spaces, and that's why it's a vicious cycle. Because if you're not publishing, you're much less likely to be able to continue pursuing your interest in this space because of all of these other steps that you kind of miss. So the way that we can do this is that we can build a program of research. And building a program of research is what you're also doing in this cycle, is slowly getting known because of publishing and collaborating and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're not totally ready for that and you feel like you're stuck in this purple or green circle, it gives us a chance to build your program from scratch and really think it through. What is a reasonable place for you to start? What sort of help do you need? How do you envision it? So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about a program of research. I'm going to use mine as an example, and I'm going to kind of talk about how it reflects this cycle. But just to make it very clear, it can be intentional or unintentional. In nursing, as a practice, there are a lot of things that we notice that are not the best standard of care. We go, wow, I'm here practicing at the bedside and I notice that, you know, saline bullets don't seem to be the best way for me to lubricate a trach. And I've been thinking the hospital policy says one thing, but my 20 years of nursing experience says something else. I want to kind of look into this. Right? And so it feels like a big ask, but you have something you're curious about. You start off with just this one question, and it can feel very overwhelming. But generally, you're starting off with this very clean path on the left side, right? You ask the question, you do something and another thing happens, you do something and another thing happens, and you can kind of build this body of work that is progressive. What can happen with that is that it feels like, first, I want to do this study on saline bullets. I'm trying to get this through hospital administration. They don't have time. It's COVID. I can't do that study. I'm on this one step and I want to go to the next step and I can't. And so when we think about the program of research as a linear path, it's very easy to derail you or block you on that path. So I want to encourage you to think about your program of research more like the model that's on the right, which this is DNA mapping. I know it's very complicated, but I wanted a model that looked complicated. And the idea is that your research question is right there where the star is. Maybe you can't go forward and proceed to the right for all of these other factors that you want to explore in terms of using saline bullets. But what you can do is go backwards and try to understand what is the state of the science, doing a meta-analysis or meta-synthesis of existing studies. You can look at theoretical and conceptual models that have been used in subacute settings where they use these type of saline bullets and try to understand, does the model account for current limitations associated with the hospital environment or with the scope of practice for nurses, right? You can kind of do that stuff that is the pre-work. You can look at any other initiatives that have tried to address this and how effective they were. So you can do a lot of work that makes this a rigorous exploration, that makes it an intentional exploration, even if you can't go right to the big question. And that pre-work is really valuable because we only know what we know. And a lot of times in nursing, it feels like I've had all of these idiosyncratic experiences that tell me that something is true. But oftentimes, you know, we're an N of one. We're one person, and our perspective can be biased or skewed, and we may not actually know what the best practice is. And it's really important to take the time to make sure that as we move forward with intention and scientific grounding. So I'm going to tell you my story. Not going to take too much time, but I do want to kind of track you through how I became, you know, who I am right now and where I am with my research. So I'm a Mexican-American first generation high school graduate from East LA. I speak Spanish. I work in community clinics. I've always worked in safety net or underserved communities. And I believe a lot in improved access to healthcare. I just don't think people have as much access to healthcare as should be a given right. I'm also a mom and a wife. I do some work for clinical work, even though I'm a researcher. I like to do a lot of community-based work, so that's me wearing all my stuff because it was COVID. But who I am is all of these things, and the daughter of a man who had diabetes, like 80% of the older people in my family. And my dad, wasn't literate, was a truck driver, never had insurance, good guy. But his diabetes, he got it very young, and he had amputations, kind of progressive amputations, and he was on dialysis for 18 years. And so I got to experience the healthcare that he experienced, secondarily, going through all of these safety net hospitals and clinics, and what it was like to be, a very proud man who was being treated all different kinds of ways. And I got to see a lot of his concerns and thoughts really being disregarded by the medical community, and a lot of disrespect. So I think I want to understand what it's like to get diabetes care, to receive diabetes care in the safety net. And so I moved to the left side of that star. I wasn't immediately able to launch into a big multi-site exploration. So instead, I wanted to look at the population that was most affected, which is Latina older women in California, right? They have pretty significant health disparities. They have high rates of diabetes and disability. And I was also interested in depression because I know that there is, I'm a nurse, we do holistic care. So my dissertation was exploring the experience of care seeking for Latina women 60 and over with diabetes and depression. So that's where my question came from. And where that question went was I did a large qualitative study where I interviewed these women and asked them about their experiences, and it resulted in a theory called the secret self-management loop. So the premise of my theory was that these women reported having a really negative experience with a provider. And that could be a physician, it could be a nurse practitioner, right? But they just had this really negative experience, and that caused them to then doubt providers' motivation. They reacted to those doubts about providers by either constantly changing doctors and not maintaining a medical home, which we know is not great for chronic illness care, or they would just go to their doctor's appointment and no longer be honest, stop telling the truth about their reality. And so they started to engage in secret self-management for their disabilities and their diseases because these were powerful, resilient women. It's not like they weren't doing anything, but they had developed their own workarounds. And sometimes those workarounds were helpful and sometimes they weren't, right? And so I published my dissertation, which immediately got me some of those collaborators that we talked about. And I was then able to reduce it to this smaller paper, which was the secret self-management loop, and it's a grounded theory of provider mistrust. So I was like, trust, interesting. I want to think about trust. So when I was going into my next stage of training, I thought there's this trust and mistrust thing happening with these older BIPOC women and providers. And I know there's other factors going on, these social determinants of health, and I'll look at that later. First, I just want to look at this dyad of people, a provider and a patient, and I've already gotten the patient perspective. So I want to understand, how do providers get to a place where they say some of the horrific things that people told me about when I did my last study? And I want to disrupt it right here. I want to stop this point where they have a bad experience and then they start doubting why the provider is there. Is it really altruism, or is it something else? So that led me to study depersonalization and diabetes care in the safety net. Again, doing things on the left side of the star, understanding kind of the lay of the land. And it turns out a lot of nurses and doctors suffer from burnout, which can impact their ability to emotionally engage with their patients and provide quality care. An aspect of burnout is depersonalization, where providers stop having the ability to display empathy when they're delivering care. And it just so happens that safety net providers, the population I'm interested in, are more likely to treat patients with type 2 diabetes because there's a lot of disparities historically in those populations. But those individuals also display a preference for an emotional connection with their providers. So it's kind of a perfect storm. And then I was able to do a larger review of the literature, and I found that studies among US Latinx have connected improved diabetes management with displays of provider empathy and trust building. Which means if I can't address depersonalization in a safety net setting, it represents a salient threat to diabetes care in this population. So the next step after this, right, because now I've gotten a few papers out and I've got some plans, was to again go back to the drawing board and conceptualize what could be happening here. And I took some time to propose and think up and propose this new figure, which was my new conceptual model, which was provider burnout patient diabetes outcomes loop. So how does this make sense, right? So if you have a burned out provider, somebody who has increased levels of burnout, they are then less, and we're following the arrows to the right, they're then less able to provide empathy, and they're probably not providing consistent processes of care. Then the patient is less willing to disclose about the barriers to adherence to these things, right? Because if I don't trust you, I'm not telling you that that particular clinic is in an area that's really unsafe for me, or maybe the sidewalk's all torn up and I'm scared I'm gonna fall, right? You're never gonna know that. So you can't problem solve for me, which leads to the next arrow down, worsen patient treatment adherence. So now, you're not gonna be following the regimen that we've outlined, for you, and therefore you're likely going to have an increase in your condition's severity, and you're going to have more complications. If you actually expand that to the entire patient panel being seen by that burned out provider, having a much more acutely ill, more clinically complex population increases provider burden, which then obviously increases burnout, right? So it is a closed loop in this theory. So the next step now, because I've published all of these little parts, is to go for a grant because I have evidence and I've now built up some collaborators. And that's what I did. I submitted this NIH L60 grant, which was exploring the impact of provider burnout on diabetes outcomes in federally qualified health centers. We did phase 1, which was more qualitative interviews to understand the FQHC setting from the administrator perspective, because I knew about patients, I knew about providers, and I wanted to know about the bosses, the people who make decisions at these clinics. So we finished that and I published it, and now we're doing phase 2, where we're validating a tool that we want to use. Again, I don't need to validate a tool necessarily. I can go on faith that this validated measure that is true in every other population is going to work here. But I need to build the body of work that I'm using. And one of those things is to justify why I chose this instrument and why not do it rigorously and publish a paper and add to the discourse on this topic. So that's what we're doing, and that's in progress. Obviously, the next thing that we're going to do is actually do the study. And then after that, we use all of this left side of the star work to build our intervention, right? And that's that right side where you're actually doing things and checking to see whether current practice, standards of practice, evidence-based care bears out, especially in unique populations. It also allowed me to think about other things from the left side of the star, like what work does depersonalizing our patients do for us? Right? And I got a lot of really good quotes so that I could understand a little bit that maybe there's some cognitive dissonance going on here with providers, and maybe there's ego integrity issues. Maybe there are competing priorities, right? Because at the end of the day, this is a business. So I get to look at the hospital system and the community clinic systems holistically and think about, where does my body of work nestle in all of these kind of overlapping environments? And when you do that kind of stuff, you publish a paper, right? So this is my most recent paper that just came out that is describing these administrator perspectives, this idea that it's a business, and how do we negotiate that? So again, this is a relatively short manuscript. I want to say it's like 2,500 words, and it got picked up. So a couple people tweeted it, so then a news outlet shared it, And now this manuscript was in the top 25% of all research outputs in their scoring algorithm. So what happened based on all of this was that I now partner with somebody at Cedars-Sinai who looks at this same phenomenon from a different direction, right? Like I am given all of these other opportunities. Just yesterday, I was contacted to be a consultant on an R01 grant, like an NIH grant, for, on the East Coast. I've never worked with these individuals before, but they'd read my work. And so you're really working smarter and not harder when you close the loop on your research and make sure you get it out there. It also helps you build this larger plan, right? This is my larger plan, my 10-year plan and the body of my work. My goal hasn't changed. I still want to really inspire and improve and support empathic diabetes care delivery in the safety net, to honor my dad, to honor all of these individuals who are willing to share their experiences with me. But now I'm able to recognize that there's different players here. And that in each one of these realms where there's different players, there's different possibilities for exploration. So when I think about my patients and how much they thought fat shaming, which they experienced a lot, how much that impacted their trust building with providers, I can do a little side study about that, right? I can do a small study, either qualitative or I could do a survey and try to understand more deeply what that means. And again, I'm still adding to the overall body of my work, but I'm making it more fleshed out and multifaceted so that, 10 years from now, I'm able to really holistically talk about depersonalization, not only how it impacts nursing and how we provide care, but how does this play out with undocumented immigrants, right? How does it play out in the penal incarceration system, like I'm not saying that right, but the justice system and justice involved individuals? How does this work, right? I really want to know how we can reconnect with people and really provide the care that they deserve, and this is how I get there. So I don't think we've been able to have anybody really come in and join for this particular topic, which is fine, because I'm going to switch it back and see if anybody's out there. But what I really would like people to do, and you can do this on your own if you're watching this after the meeting, is really quickly jot down your topic of interest or your research focus. Try to use 5 words or fewer in the chat. This is your little, instead of an elevator speech, which is like 2 or 3 minutes, this is like your abridged version of what do you care about? Because if you're not ready to define your piece, empathic diabetes care in the safety net, then there's some time to do the left side of the star work for you still. And that's great, right? Because it means there's a lot of studies, smaller, what we call sensitizing studies, that don't cost a ton of money and that can be supported by student effort, that can really start building direction and intention into your research program. And that's what we're going to be doing from now on in this group. We're going to see if anybody else here shares your topic so that you can collaborate and share the work. And future meetings right now are really open. I made some suggestions about what I thought might be helpful, just kind of refreshing people's ideas about a table of evidence and reviews of the literature and kind of how do we get those to a place where they can be published. But it's really open, and I want to make sure that the people involved are the ones kind of directing the effort, and that's kind of the basic idea. I do want to thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. But thank you so much for watching this and being interested. We all have limited amounts of time and limited amounts of commitment that we can offer. I want you to know that I don't do any gatekeeping. You can participate as little or as much as you'd like. And I really am here to just kind of build a support structure that we can all use and benefit from, including myself, because I really look forward to collaborating with you all. So that's all. I'm going to stop the meeting and return to the Teams group, but I hope everyone is well and have a good evening.